So we asked Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, Texas immigration attorney and our resident immigration expert, to come back and talk about some of these things. Kate, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me back on.
Okay, let's start with Donald Trump. He recently made remarks that as part of the assessment as to whether or not a migrant gets in to the United States, there is going to be some sort of ideological screening. I assume that means he wants them all to write essays about how terrific Donald Trump is and how they love him, because that seems to be what, like, Congress people do to get on his good side. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, of course, I think it's a pretty concerning concept, because he's really aiming at, when he says ideology, I think he's aiming at religion, and he's talking about banning people of certain religions. I would assume he's talking about banning Muslim immigrants from entering the country, which of course would be a violation of our constitutional principles.
Or you could turn that around and say that he's trying to nudge, wink, wink, tell his supporters that he would only let Christians in.
Right. And, this is something that we have seen throughout our history as a nation. It goes in fits and starts, I think is the phrase that they use. But, back in the 1700s, Irish Catholics, who were not Protestant, were targeted and banned. And so there's just been iteration, Italians, Jews, Chinese people, there's just been iterations of this. And lately it's our, anti-immigrant sentiment, people who have been targeted have been Latin Americans, people along the southern border, mostly Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, who are the people who are mostly coming to seek asylum right now. Well, you better be
careful about that, because there is a lot of Catholicism. There's a lot of Christianity in a lot of those countries. I mean, come on. We know that this is supposed to filter out the people we don't want. So how can we filter out all those brown people we don't want when we've already said we're going to let them in if they're Christians?
You are exactly right. So you watch the rhetoric, because when we're talking about asylum seekers along the southern border, you will hear Trump and people like him use, drug trafficking, human trafficking. They will equate migrants to the cartels, and they'll say that, they're bringing in all of the fentanyl. And then when there is something going on like what we're seeing in Israel, then the rhetoric changes and it becomes about ideology and religion. And so it's, whoever they're trying to keep out, they will use the language that they think will inflame their base and frankly, terrify people. Fear is such a powerful motivator for politicians, and that's what we're seeing. And we're going to see a lot more of this as the elections come, and all of this language is just going to get really, really out of hand. And so we should all be watching for it. Just anytime you hear any of these buzzwords, ideology, terrorism, human trafficking, human smuggling, drug trafficking, all of which are actual things that we don't want and should be concerned about. But anytime you hear those equated with immigration, that's when alarm bells should go off in your mind.
And your prediction is we're going to be hearing more of those words. I mean, we have not only Donald Trump, but we have someone who is essentially his surrogate now as Speaker of the House of Representatives. I know that the current Speaker has expressed that he doesn't like gay people, and he wants there to be an abortion ban, and he doesn't like Social Security, and he doesn't like Medicare. He's an election denier. He's very pro-religion. I haven't heard any of his positions on immigration, but looking at his positions on other issues, I don't hold out a lot of hope that this is a guy who can reach some kind of bipartisan deal with the Democrats on immigration reform.
Absolutely not. I mean, there's just no way that is in the cards, certainly before the election. And then beyond the election, I think I've shared with you, your listeners before, that my guess on this is that our economy is going to have to get so bad we cannot find workers as our baby boomers age, that it's so clear that we need immigration, that then the businesses, industry will start to lobby for it. And down the line, when the economy is suffering and we're all suffering enough, we might see immigration reform. But before that, frankly, it's just too powerful for the Republicans. This rhetoric, it's like abortion for them. But immigration is just this power word that they just whisper it, and people start shaking. Mm-hmm. and it's like, oh no, immigration, it's terrible. When in fact, of course, it's what built this country, and it's needed so badly right now.
And this is kind of tricky to talk about, but it seems to me there's another layer to this, because many of us know of people who are white and European and come to the United States and seem to get that green card, and everything just goes so smoothly. It seems to me that there's a real layer of discrimination, racial discrimination, built into a lot of this too. Is that your perspective?
Oh, for sure. I mean, historically, it's in the history books. I mean, when we passed our current law was passed in 1965, and it's, rests upon the premise that family and industry are the most important drivers of immigration. But before that, in 1917, Congress passed an immigration reform about who could immigrate to the United States. And they grappled for years with how to pass a law that would be racist and would also be held up in the court system. And, they threw a few things at the wall and they didn't stick. And finally what they passed was a system in which we took a snapshot of the U.S. population and granted visas or immigrant visas to people in the same, what's the word I'm looking for? Distribution as the U.S. population, meaning if 85% of the U.S. population is white, European, Protestant, religion wasn't in it, but, from certain countries in Europe, let's say, then we're going to allocate visas to those people, and 85% of the immigrants will start coming from there. And that's how they did it. That's how they passed a racist immigration law, and it achieved the whitening of America from 1917 to 1965. Immigrants that drastically changed and became more white during that period. So it was a successful law.
Wow. I did not realize that.
Yeah.
The vice president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America's Illinois chapter recently said in an interview with one of the newsletters I read, Axios Chicago, is a gentleman by the name of Pavlo Bendrivsky. He said that there's a program called Uniting for Ukraine, which I'd like you to tell me if you're familiar with. But also, he said the Uniting for Ukraine program is being looked at, assuming by the federal government, as a model for future immigration to the United States. Are you familiar with Uniting for Ukraine?
I am. And, I think it's relevant to just the previous question that you asked me, because here's what we've seen. Uniting for Ukraine is a parole program, which authorizes Ukrainian people to come to the United States if they don't have some other way to immigrate, like family or employment, for example. And so they get to come here just as like an emergency parole program. And that program has been vastly successful. I don't know the numbers offhand, but thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian people have come under that program. In contrast to that, the Biden administration announced a similar program in Afghanistan, and only 1% of the applicants in Afghanistan for the same program have been approved to come over. So that program, the parole program for Afghanistan, has ended up being essentially a non-program. while the United for Ukraine parole program has allowed, let's say 90% of the applicants in. And you look at the two populations and the difference in the populations and you wonder why. Mm-hmm. What's the difference here? So I think that when people talk about parole programs like these are the future of immigration, what they mean is we want to pick and choose. And of course, this whole idea of a refugee and helping people globally arose after World War II, when we as a nation failed to protect Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. We turned them back in ships, turned them away. And then I've got to read
the history of that, because I can't imagine, I just can't imagine that happening and how anybody could justify that. But sorry, that hits a real chord with me of just disbelief. We've always done some pretty outrageous things when it comes to immigration, and we've frequently had people justify those things. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead, Kate.
Well, I mean, I agree, and that's sort of the point, is that this is why we shouldn't do spot programs based on the ideology of whoever is running the country at that time. We need to have a set system for reviewing who is a refugee. It's someone who's fleeing persecution in their country based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, their membership in a particular social group. And it's not based on what our opinions are in the moment. And we have this very robust body of law built upon this idea that it's not situational. This idea of protecting refugees is not situational. It's fundamental. And so I think that United for Ukraine was good. I think that the parole program, had it worked for Afghanistan, is a good way to extend and expand in times of emergency. But should that be how we do immigration? Absolutely not, because we need something that will survive all of the shifting, anti-immigrant sentiment that occurs in this country.
President Biden recently announced that he was either going to expand or reinstate the visa program for professionals who have a certain area of expertise. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I mean, I think any moves like that are good moves because we have a need for more immigrants, extended programs in all areas, in high skill spectrum, all the way down to low skilled jobs, agriculture, construction, et cetera. And so anything that, our leadership can do to expand the ability of people to immigrate and stay in the United States is good. What I will also say is that we've reached this point where Congress doesn't pass any immigration laws. They can't even pass, status for the dreamers. And so what happens is we see presidents enact, executive orders or whatever sort of memos or announcements they can do, and then they will immediately be sued in federal court, and those programs will get enjoined because the judge, maybe this is a conservative anti-immigrant judge, and they think that the president who, passed the DACA program overstepped their authority, and then the program gets enjoined. That's what we've seen for DACA. And so this is no way for laws to be created. It is inefficient and it causes confusion. And so back to the main point about could we please as a nation get to the point where we just recognize that immigration actually is good. Immigration is not bad. And if we could get there together, then we could, pass laws that would, reflect our needs. But seeing that happen in this era, it just feels very far off.
Mm-hmm. In Monica Eng's reporting for Axios Chicago, one of the differences that she pointed out with, say, the Venezuelan migrants who've arrived in Chicago and Ukrainian migrants is that because there's already such a huge Ukrainian population in Chicago, they have their own social structures. They have support structures, and it is easier to integrate new arriving Ukrainians with this huge pre-existing Ukrainian community. But we don't have that when it comes to Venezuelans. We don't have a Venezuelan neighborhood or, any kind of Venezuelan cultural infrastructure in the city of Chicago. So how kind of a role does that play?
We need to look to Greg Abbott for this problem. Greg Abbott is the creator of this problem. All of these Venezuelans did not just cross the border and go, you know what, let's all go to Chicago, where there is not already a community for us there. They were all invited by Greg Abbott to get on private chartered buses to go to Chicago, and his point in doing this was not to be kind and friendly to migrants who needed a ride. His point was to create problems in Chicago so that more people would talk about how immigration is, a problem. It extends this idea that immigration equals bad, because if the people in Chicago are feeling overwhelmed, if the people in New York City are feeling overwhelmed, there starts to become this national conversation around immigrants overrunning our cities. But the reality of the situation is that immigrants, when they come in, they naturally go to where their communities are. Of course, they go to where their families are and their friends are. And when we take them out of that natural flow and put them in Chicago, it causes all sorts of problems for everybody. And so what we need to do is start, and this is, I've been surprised that so many people are bamboozled by this and they're looking in the wrong direction, when in fact everybody needs to be looking directly at the state of Texas and at Greg Abbott and say, hey, stop doing this. Mm-hmm. Let these migrants go to where they want to go. And I, my opinion is this problem will dissipate.
Kate, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch is the owner and CEO of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law in Austin, Texas. She's also the co-host of a podcast, Law Moms Out Loud. Thank you, Kate, for talking to us about this. And we'll probably, let's look at our watches. We'll probably talk again in another couple of 3 weeks as things develop.
I'm sure there will be more to discuss.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.